some people complaining to Leah before church that she only had 4 verses to read. And sometimes it's, that much scripture. It's not my fault, guys. There's this book that has all the readings in it. And I select one from that book every week. But they were decided years and years and years and years and years ago, it's not my fault. And I'd like you to notice the title up here is not what's in your bulletin. Please don't tell Deanne I changed the title again. She gets grumpy. Timothy was in my very first ever Sunday school class I ever taught. It was 2nd through 5th graders at Treasure Coast Christian Church in Port St. Lucie, Florida. And every time we read a story, like the story of Moses being rescued from the river, or David defeating Goliath, or Noah and the ark, when I asked who the main character in the story was, Timothy put his hand up and said, it was Jesus! And I would have to explain that Jesus wasn't in that particular story, that he would come along later in the book. Timothy would always be a little bit disappointed because he really, really loved Jesus. One of the problems that we sometimes encounter is trying to lay our 21st century understandings on events that happened a long time ago. Sometimes we have a problem trying to put Jesus back into the Old Testament before he actually got here. The Exodus happened something like 3,500 years ago, and about 1,500 years before the resurrection. It's hard for people of our time to wrap our minds around the way people thought 3,500 years ago, and especially how they might understand God in those days. So we come to the story of the golden calf, and we try to understand why they would demand a God be made for them. Didn't they understand that their God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, couldn't be represented by anything living? Well, no, they didn't. They didn't have the commandments yet. They didn't know there was a rule against it. Nobody ever told them that. They didn't know a whole lot about this God Yahweh because they had been under Egyptian rule for some 400 years. They, really hadn't been taught a lot about this particular God. And one of the members of my previous church used to ask me all the time, how can they keep forgetting God? Like, well, if you're not taught about something, you don't know it. It's not like they had books, because they didn't. Frankly, we don't know a whole lot about how Abraham and the other patriarchs understood God, or how they worshiped God, or what they taught their families about God. We do know that even Jacob's wife, Rachel, thought it was necessary to steal the God statues out of her father's home, so she obviously didn't understand a whole lot about Jacob's God. We also know that for some 400 years, the tribes of Israel were ruled by people whose gods were represented by statues and paintings. Cat-headed gods and dog-headed gods and very interesting looking gods. So when they started getting afraid that Moses wasn't coming back because he'd been up on that mountain a very long time, it made sense that they would want something that they could see and touch and understand. So Aaron had them give up all their jewelry, and from those offerings he made a figure in the shape of a calf. And of course, here, while I was thinking about this, I got all sidetracked, and well, he had to make a mold, but doesn't tell us any of that. Today's reading cuts off with Aaron presenting the calf to the people of Israel and saying, here are your gods. It goes on to say, when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it and made proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord. And they rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being, and the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to make merry. The Hebrew word that translates here as Lord, and I almost never do this Hebrew word thing, but I have to do it this time because This particular Hebrew word that translates as Lord is only ever used to describe the God of Abraham, not any of the other gods present at that time. None of the other ones that are mentioned in Scripture. In their minds, in Aaron's mind, this calf is a representation of their God, the one that Moses was busy talking to up on the mountain. Here is a figure to adore and make sacrifices in front of and celebrate over. This is what they were used to, so this is what they wanted. They were shocked and terrified when Moses came back with the Lord that God was angry with them. But Moses, we've always done it this way. Well, Israel, it's time for something new. What they did have, what is very clear from this passage, is a need for God. In our Wednesday Bible study, we were talking about the practice of the ancient Greeks of putting an altar to the unknown God in their temples. Our assumption is that they knew something was missing from their pantheon of gods, so they always included this one that they didn't know anything about. We talked about how that indicated that they had an empty feeling, a God-shaped hole within them that needed to be filled, and that the gods they knew were not sufficient. So the people of Israel cheerfully gave up their golden earrings, the accumulated wealth of their families, so that Aaron could make a calf. They literally gave it up for God. They were happy to donate what had taken possibly years to acquire in order to have a God, something to fill that empty space within. They gave cheerfully and selflessly and worshiped this God they didn't understand the best way they knew how. How were they to know this was not what God required of them? Nobody told them. No one had ever told them that this wasn't the right way to do it. Moses was still on the mountain. What is this empty feeling? Even those of us who are Christian and belong to a church and show up for worship services regularly and tithe and do all that stuff, still sometimes find ourselves grappling with that empty feeling. Sometimes we try to fill it with stuff, with food or spending or activities or people or exercising. I do not try to fill it with exercising. Sometimes we try to fill it with volunteering. We believe ourselves to be giving selflessly, giving of ourselves with no expectation of reward. This week on Facebook, my friend Frank Lopez started a discussion asking whether selflessness and selfishness were truly different things, or whether they were in fact the same thing. His point was this, that even when we are giving of ourselves, of our money, our time, and talents, with no expectation of recognition or reward, even if we do these things anonymously so that nobody can possibly know who it was that gave or did that good thing, like whoever decorates the restroom downstairs, making me crazy. It's gorgeous all the time. No idea who does that. Even when we do it anonymously like that, we're still getting something out of it. Because, quite honestly, it feels good to give. It feels good to volunteer, to end the day knowing that we have done something that will make life better for somebody else. So, are we truly being selfless? Or must we call these actions selfish? I don't have an answer for you. We each get to grapple with that one for ourselves. I will tell you, though, that I don't mind a bit selfishly enjoying the good feeling that comes when someone else benefits from whatever it is I've done. The people of Israel gave generously in order to have a focus for their worship, a calf. It was the wrong thing to do, but the motivation came from that empty feeling they had that God-shaped whole that required a focus for their worship, for their love, for their devotion. Now, if I asked Timothy what was the most important thing to remember from this scripture lesson, I'm pretty sure he would have smiled and said, Jesus! Because for Timothy, everything was about Jesus. But you know, he wouldn't be wrong. John Calvin said, we ought to read the scriptures with the express design of finding Christ in them. So where do we find Christ in this passage from Exodus? The people of Israel felt empty inside, alone, deserted by Moses, fearful and uncertain in a strange place. And because of these feelings, they reached out to Aaron, the brother of Moses, asking him for something that would fill that hole, that empty place. They were in a hurry. They didn't know how long Moses would take on that mountaintop. They didn't know whether to trust either Moses or God, because they didn't know them well enough to just wait, to just have faith that sooner or later they would receive whatever it was they needed. They were willing to give everything they had to fill that hole, but they weren't willing to simply wait for what they needed to come to them. If we would fill that empty space, that God-shaped hole that comes to everybody now and again, we'll wait. We will have faith that God is there even when we feel most alone, even when we feel deserted. We will remember that after centuries of living in slavery, God saved the children of Abraham and led them out of captivity. And we will remember that after many more centuries, when the people of the world were still living in sin and solitude, God sent Jesus the Christ to teach and save the entire world, to fill that God-shaped hole in all of humanity. And because we remember these things, because we believe that Jesus is the Christ, we will wait for the right time. We will be patient, knowing that whatever it is we need to fill that empty space will come. It will be provided by God when the time is right. And while we wait, we will continue to offer our gifts and our talents to the Lord our God, so that they may be used in the best possible ways to further God's work in the world, bringing peace and understanding to our neighbors. If your empty place can be filled by accepting Christ today, or if you're looking for a church home and want to become part of this family here, you're invited to come forward during the singing of our hymn of commitment, Take My Gift.